as we're continuing to talk about the claim that later Gospels show development by focusing more on the Pharisees, I'm coming today to a slightly different version of the hypothesis. What I've been examining and refuting up to this point specifically is the claim that you get more and more of this negative engagement with the Pharisees, and that Matthew has more negative engagement with the Pharisees than Luke and Mark. That's a claim that Craig Keener makes in his Matthew commentary, and then more still in John. And we've been refuting that. We've been seeing that specifically Luke has somewhat more negative portrayals, just counting them, even in various categories, than Matthew does, and quite a lot more than John. And in general, the Synoptics have a lot more negative interaction with the Pharisees, negative comments about the Pharisees and so forth, than John does. And there's always a temptation in these kinds of contexts, especially with a very highly respected scholar, to sort of move the goalposts and say, well, okay, let's talk about this other theory over here until we find one, that we can say, where we can say the description of the evidence is at least accurate, at least as far as that goes. Keener does assert a slightly different development thesis about John, eliminating other groups, allegedly, to focus on the Pharisees. This is in his John commentary. One might suggest, he says, that the fourth gospel generally transforms the priestly leaders in traditional sources into Pharisees, leaders whose role in repressing minority factions in John's day corresponded to aristocratic priests in Jesus' day. Now, let's get clear. What we're talking about then here is an ahistorical, anti-historical shift. He calls it updating language at one point. That's a very confusing way to talk about it. What we're supposedly talking about here, if you just listen to what that sentence says, is the suggestion that John is taking people who were not Pharisees, and he's saying that a group that did something was the group of Pharisees. He's transforming non-Pharisees into Pharisees, because this somehow represents the people who are persecuting John's readers. This is especially a strange statement about in traditional sources, transforming priestly leaders in traditional sources into Pharisees, because most of the stories that involve Pharisees in John's gospel are not in any other sources that we currently possess. So it's not like, if you take, let's say, the story of the man born blind, it's not like we have some other source of the man born blind that says that the people involved there were priests, much less any implication that there were no Pharisees involved. John could have additional information anyway, but we don't have any other source about the story of the man born blind. John is our only source. So there's absolutely, it just fails to even get off the ground to say that there's some traditional source in which the bad guys in that story are priests, and that John transforms them into Pharisees in his version. His version is the only version we have. And the same is true of many other places. The attempt to arrest Jesus during the Feast of the Tabernacles, it's not in any other gospel. The complaint after Jesus has had the triumphal entry. Now that one, to the extent that there's anything similar in another gospel, in Luke also attributes it to the Pharisees, that they're unhappy about what happened in the triumphal entry. But we've got, or the insider meeting, where the chief priests and the Pharisees in John 11 are talking about what they're going to do. It's not in any other gospel, that meeting and that conference. When they send messengers to John the Baptist, we'll see in the next video that it's a big deal for Keener, But there is no story in the Synoptic Gospels about somebody sending messengers to John the Baptist to ask who he is. So once again, there isn't some other source that we can call that the traditional source and then say John's transforming it. Very strange statement. All right, here's another quote. The Judeans may represent the heirs of the Jerusalem leaders in Yavna. Yavna was a later center of Judaism after the fall of Jerusalem, which was in Judea. The impression one gets from the fourth gospel is that the Johannine community or its allies in Galilee felt repressed by the Judean Pharisees or their allies in Asia. After all, the Pharisees represent only part of the opposition in Mark, much more in Matthew, but have become identical with the opposition in John. The Sadducees do not appear in John. So here's your statement of development again. Now, just to begin with this statement that one gets an impression from the fourth gospel about who's persecuting the Johannine community or their allies in Asia or Judea. There's nothing about that in the fourth gospel. One only gets that impression if one thinks in these very strange, literary critical, questionable ways where you're reading a series of statements about what supposedly happened during Jesus' ministry, and then you're, kind of going into a trance and trying to think of, what impression does that give me about what the audience was undergoing? It's completely conjectural, very dubious, not something that we should grant. The impression you get is that these things happened to Jesus during his ministry, because that's what John is talking about. You shouldn't be getting any impression about the Johannine community feeling repressed by the Judean Pharisees or their allies in Asia. Like, who gets that impression from reading a gospel that says nothing on that topic whatsoever? It really, really revealing phrase. One gets the impression. I wouldn't even recommend doing that with Luke, who in fact does have somewhat more, the Gospel of Luke, negative stuff about the Pharisees in Jesus' ministry. I wouldn't say, one gets the impression that Theophilus was being repressed by the Pharisees in his own day in the 60s, possibly in this region. It's like, what? No, he's telling Theophilus what happened in Jesus' ministry. Theophilus being Luke's immediate audience. So we shouldn't be doing this at all. Okay, now let's look at this become identical with the opposition in John. That's, again, completely false. It doesn't even describe the data accurately. The short version is about half the time that the Pharisees are in the opposition in John, they are the only specific group mentioned, and about half the time they are mentioned with another group, the chief priests. Okay, and this is even if we treat certain passages as being oppositional, where they're not really all that oppositional, okay, but where apparently Keener thinks of them as being oppositional, like sending messengers to ask John the Baptist who he is. I think that was a very natural question to ask John the Baptist. So compared to, some other stories, both in John and in the Synoptics, where Jesus is really getting into it with the Pharisees, the fact that they send people to ask John the Baptist, who are you and why are you baptizing? Why are we even counting that as the opposition? But even if we count it that way, it's about half and half. So there is no pattern at all in which John is focusing on the Pharisees to the detriment of focusing on other groups. In fact, John agrees with Luke Acts, both written by the same author, in portraying what was a historically complex situation. For example, Luke portrays Joseph of Arimathea as dissenting from the council's decision to kill Jesus. Luke expressly says that. We don't know for sure whether Joseph of Arimathea was a Sadducee or a Pharisee. The liberal critic Tyson suggested he might have been a Pharisee. I don't know, maybe Peter thinks he was a Sadducee. That's not my point. My point is that Luke is portraying dissent among the leaders, even though the majority of the leaders are against Jesus. In Acts, Gamaliel is a very influential Pharisee, counsels not killing the apostles. He doesn't really appear to have much of a problem with beating them. But just a few chapters later, we find Gamaliel's most famous, devout Pharisee pupil, Saul of Tarsus, zealously persecuting the Christians. And apparently some of them also died under those circumstances. So, it's not that the Pharisees are, positive toward the Christians in Acts. Gamaliel counsels a certain amount of moderation in their approach. Saul apparently says, sorry, teacher, I don't agree with you, and he goes out and launches a persecution. But now John portrays Nicodemus, who is explicitly said to be a Pharisee, as dissenting in a low-key way from the anti-Jesus views of the rest of the religious leaders, and eventually coming forward to help to bury Jesus. John even portrays dissent among the Pharisees without naming anybody about evaluating Jesus in John 9. That some of them seem to be saying, how could he heal the blind if he's evil, and others are like, no, he's a sinner because he healed on the Sabbath day. So again, historical complexity and nuance in John concerning the Pharisees, as opposed to some kind of ahistorical focus on John where he's transforming priests into Pharisees. There's absolutely no evidence of that. So we have, I'm going to define incidents. I just want to say here in these statistics I'm giving you about incidents in the Gospel of John, in a pretty broad way, whether that's, Pharisees or priests. Okay, so I'm going to try to be consistent with that. So on a fairly broad definition of incidents, we have 8 incidents in which the Pharisees are involved. I'm leaving out the pericopai adulteri, that is the story of the woman taken in adultery. That in any event would not be an incident in which they're acting alone, because it says the scribes were involved there as well. Some scribes were Pharisees, some Pharisees were scribes, but they were not completely overlapping groups. But I'm just leaving that one out because we don't know if that one was originally in John. All right, and I'm trying to construe incident broadly, whatever direction that seems to cut in the argument, the statistics. Of these 8 incidents, 4 involve the Pharisees being mentioned and nobody else, no other specific group is mentioned. And 4, another specific group is definitely mentioned, so they're definitely not acting alone. Now, I'm not saying that the Pharisees were definitely alone when they're the only group mentioned. There could have been chief priests involved there, and then on the other hand, if the chief priests are the only ones mentioned, maybe the Pharisees were also involved. But we don't know. And so if we're using Keener's approach, where we're looking at who's mentioned, who's named, when I say the Pharisees alone are mentioned, I'm not saying John asserts that they were the only ones. And by the same token, if the chief priests alone are mentioned, that doesn't mean that he asserts that they're the only ones. But we're trying to see, is John trying to narrow it down to make as much as possible the opposition identical with the Pharisees identical with the opposition, in order to make his gospel more relevant to his readers. That's the thesis. Doesn't look like that at all. So here are the 4 where the Pharisees are the only ones mentioned. Hearing that Jesus is baptizing more people than John the Baptist, which isn't even really that oppositional. Jesus goes to Galilee when he hears that they heard that his disciples were baptizing more than John the Baptist. An argument where they say to Jesus, you're testifying to yourself, so your testimony is not true. That's the beginning of John 8. The man born blind incident, which includes within the incident the decree that if someone says Jesus is the Christ, he will be thrown out of the synagogue. And then complaining about the triumphal entry and the fact that nothing they're doing is succeeding, Jesus continues to be very popular. Those are the four where only the Pharisees are named. And then four, where they're definitely not alone, as portrayed in John. The messengers coming to John the Baptist. It says that those who came were out of or from the Pharisees. So the Pharisees have some role in sending, but it's priests and Levites who actually come. No reason to think they're coming under protest or anything. So it's multiple groups together coming to ask these rather natural questions of John the Baptist. So they're not acting alone. All right, sending the temple guard to try to arrest Jesus in John 7, and that's said to be the chief priests and the Pharisees. Getting together and plotting in John 11. So you've got Pharisees there. You've also got Caiaphas, the high priest, and they're trying to decide what to do. And they decide that they're going to try to kill Jesus. All right, and then chapter 18, sending those who do arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's said to be the chief priests and Pharisees. All right, so it's 4 and 4. So where is this, the Pharisees are identical with the opposition? It's not even really close. All right, let's see. Now let's look at the chief priests. And this is very interesting and very indicative, okay? The chief priests are often acting with the Pharisees. So if we look at, where are the chief priests mentioned as acting with the Pharisees, it's just slightly over half of the incidents, if we count the incidents in this very broad way. And slightly under half of the incidents where it only mentions the chief priests acting alone. If we counted incidents in a slightly different way, though, we'd actually have half and half again. All right, so very close. The 6 places where chief priests are being counted as being in the opposition, in 4 they're said to be acting with the Pharisees, and in 2 they're named alone. All right, so the 4 where they're acting with Pharisees, I've already mentioned these, right? Coming to John the Baptist to ask him questions, sending guards to try to arrest Jesus, plotting to kill Jesus with the famous words of Caiaphas, and sending those who actually do arrest Jesus in the garden. Okay, those are those 4. But then we have, from the time that Jesus enters the high priest's palace, all the way through the crucifixion and Pilate, and asking Pilate to write something different to put over Jesus' head and so forth, the priests only are mentioned. Now, you could actually count this as multiple instances, and then, you'd have exactly half and half, But if you count the entire section from the high priest's palace through the entire crucifixion and all their interactions with Pilate as one incident, then you have 2, which is that, and one other I'll get to in a moment. It's a biggie, where only the chief priests are named. All right, here's a real biggie. I've saved it for the last of the ones involving the chief priests. John 12:10. They're plotting to murder Lazarus, specifically. And only the chief priests are mentioned. Could the Pharisees have been involved? Sure. Maybe they were. But by the same token, where the Pharisees only are mentioned, could the chief priests have been involved? Sure. All right, so that doesn't, that's a wash. But remember, the thesis is that John is trying to make his readers feel like his gospel is relevant to them by, narrowing down on the opposition and even non-historically attributing things to the Pharisees when it was really the priestly opponents. And here we have an incident that would be perfect for his doing that, if that's really how John thinks, I would go so far, and I don't usually go this far, but I would go so far as to say that if Keener's thesis about the way that John thinks and about John's having no scruples about changing priests into Pharisees even when there weren't, were true, we would positively expect that if he includes this incident of a plot to murder Lazarus, Jesus' follower, he would at least include the Pharisees, if not attributing it to them alone. But they're not even mentioned. Okay? So, and you can't say, well, that's because there was some other, well-known non-Johannine source, and he couldn't go against it. We don't know of any non-Johannine source. The whole story of the raising of Lazarus is unique to John. So if John isn't constrained just by the truth, and if he's trying to make people feel like, yeah, Jesus understands you, he was opposed by those mean old Pharisees who are persecuting you as well, why not say that the Pharisees were involved in plotting to murder a follower of Jesus who was attesting to having been, miraculously raised from the dead by Jesus, and so therefore was of interest. I mean, it's a perfect sort of representative of the followers of Jesus. They're testifying to what Jesus has done in their lives, and here's a group plotting to murder them, and who is it in John? Drum roll. The chief priests. No mention of the Pharisees. So this is a huge counterexample, right in and of itself, to this thesis. Another counterexample is John 5. I haven't said a whole lot about John 5 because no specific group is named. It's a Sabbath controversy. It's unique to John. Jesus heals a man at the pool of Bethesda and tells him to pick up his cot. So it's breaking the rule against working on the Sabbath in two different ways there. Healing on the Sabbath, telling him to carry something on the Sabbath. And there's anger about that. The Pharisees are not mentioned. The chief priests are not mentioned. It just says the Jews. It's just this kind of non-specific phrase. Once again, if John is even willing to transform priests into Pharisees in order to stick something to the Pharisees, then when he tells a story about a Sabbath controversy, which probably, if it happened, probably was the Pharisees. They're the ones who are so worried about all these nitpicky little rules. Why would he not say Pharisees? Why would he use the broader term? So again, we've just got so much counterexample evidence against this claim about the Pharisees being the opposition in John. So how does Keener write on the rare occasion when he even confronts any counter evidence? Well, here we go. This is on the fact that the chief priests and Pharisees are said to have sent the people who arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It would be difficult for John to omit the high priests from the traditional Passion narrative or the events leading up to it. Whatever the reason, John, who focuses on the Pharisees, does not eliminate altogether the high priestly opposition in the Jesus tradition, though he omits explicit mention of the Sadducees, the group to which most of the high priests adhered. All right, did you hear that? All he says is, well, he's not able to eliminate them altogether. We have no evidence that he was trying to eliminate them at all. Okay, where's the evidence for this psychologizing of John? This is so lame as a response that I would say it scarcely even rises to the level of an ad hoc hypothesis. An ad hoc hypothesis is supposed to make some attempt to explain away the counter evidence. Here, Keener halfway acknowledges the counter evidence, namely that, it's not just the Pharisees who are sending to arrest Jesus in the garden, it's the Pharisees and the chief priests. And then he just sort of insinuates that John wanted to eliminate them but couldn't quite get away with it because, their role in Jesus' passion was too well known or something like that. But as we've already seen, there are places where the groups work together that aren't part of the passion narrative. The attempted arrest at the Feast of Tabernacles, that's, a good 6 months before. Keener has no explanation of John's including a unique story of the plot to murder Lazarus. shortly before the Passion and attributing it to the chief priests. Certainly couldn't have been forced upon John by the pre-existence of a synoptic tradition, as I've already mentioned. No explanation for the nuance that John provides concerning differences of opinion among the Pharisees and so forth. All right, so no, okay? There's no evidence that John wanted to eliminate or would have wanted to eliminate the chief priests, but somehow doesn't quite eliminate the chief priests. There's no evidence of his even trying to eliminate the chief priests. He includes them quite with some frequency in unique stories that are in his gospel alone. Now, there's one little bit of information in that last sentence that I just read. He omits explicit mention of the Sadducees, the group to which most of the high priests adhered. You remember back at the beginning I read a quote that said the Sadducees do not appear in John. Now, by Dr. Keener's own account, most of the high priests and the chief priests, were Sadducees. So whenever John mentions the chief priests, and he doesn't seem to think that all the chief priests were Pharisees, he speaks of them as at least partly separate groups. He is mentioning de facto Sadducees. But, okay, so here we're shifting a little bit. Well, but he doesn't use the word Sadducees. And so my response to that is, yeah, and? So what? How does his not using the word Sadducees indicate that he's trying to eliminate other groups' opposition to Jesus and replace that opposition with the Pharisees' opposition? It doesn't. It doesn't support that at all. He includes a different group repeatedly, the chief priests. He just doesn't happen to refer to Sadducees. Moreover, get this, in the entire Gospel of Mark and the entire Gospel of Luke, there is only one reference to the Sadducees by name as the Sadducees, and it's the same story in both, where they're coming to ask Jesus about to whom shall a woman be married in the resurrection. You may remember that story. Trying to play a little theological gotcha because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. So their being Sadducees is very relevant to the specific question that they ask. That's it. And there are many references to the Pharisees in Mark, as we've seen. We've just been going over them through video after video, and in Luke. And as compared with only this one explicit mention of the Sadducees. So for John to just have no explicit mentions of the Sadducees and a number of mentions of the chief priests, it's not unusual at all. And Mark and Luke are supposed to be the earliest Gospels in this development thesis that Keener has going. So why is it not a big deal that they use the word Sadducees only once? I mean, what are we going to say? John has 100% fewer because they have one and he has none. I mean, that would be very, very strained, very artificial. The fact of the matter is that there is no pattern here. And Dr. Keener, unfortunately, just doesn't recognize it. Nothing that indicates that John is even attempting to narrow the opposition to the Pharisees or focus on them in some exaggerated way. It just looks like the usual messiness of history, what I've called the randomness of saliency. The better conclusion is that John does not update his language. In other words, changing what groups were historically involved at all. And that he has no agenda to de-emphasize other groups. And that, like Luke, John is just telling what happened. This is what real history is like. From all the Gospels, it appears that multiple, either non-overlapping or partially overlapping groups among the religious leaders were opposing Jesus during his ministry. Pharisees, Sadducees, lawyers, scribes, chief priests, and some of these are more and less overlapping, and that there were some who became his followers. There were some exceptions, like Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea and others who aren't named, but it's just said that some of them did. And that's it. History's just messy like that. So, besides the non-existent occurrence of more and more engagement with Pharisaism, which we've refuted in other videos, besides the fact that the word Sadducees doesn't occur in John, and besides bare assertion, unsupported by any evidence whatsoever, what arguments does Dr. Keener provide for this development theory? Next time, we'll see what's left. I think that will all be doable in a single video. We'll see. And what's left is a priori history and very implausible redaction criticism. Please like and subscribe if you're interested in this content. The content in this development theories of the Gospels are all Bunk series here, and in the others that I've done over the years is exclusive to my YouTube channel and the audio that's transported over to the podcast. It's not in my books. Okay, so, and it's not monetized either. As you know, all YouTube videos, unfortunately, YouTube has put some commercials on them. That doesn't mean that the person making the content gets any money out of it. I don't monetize this at all. For free, you can subscribe to this channel and get exclusive content. So I hope you'll do that, tell others about it, and click like. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.